The propaganda's a win, stress feeding on my tension. My countrymen, they love their fiction. Words are now, it's made with good intentions.
Kia ora, ni hao, welcome to 1 or 200. This is your host, Philip. A bit of a different episode today. Long-time listeners will remember friend of the show, BFF of the show, Paul Calland is back on the cast today for a special episode discussing Labour's Future Fund announcement, which has been a long time coming, to say the least. There's been sturm and drang in the media about Labour's lack of policy, which, you know, to some people has been a problem, and to other people have gone, oh, good, keep your powder dry until we have something exciting to announce. So this is the exciting thing to announce. We're breaking the seal, ending the virginity of the Labour Party's policy announcements with Chris Hipkins's enthusiastic explosion onto the scene with their finance spokesperson, Barbara Edmonds, about what they're calling the Future Fund, which will be a new fund to make all our dreams come true. And obviously this isn't going to be their only announcement. There'll be a whole suite of policies announced even over the next few weeks, I think they're saying. So before we strawman them too badly, this is obviously going to be part of a puzzle of whatever Labour's quote-unquote vision will be for the next election. But we can get into that. Paul, how are you, my friend?
Good. Thanks for having me on. It's good to be back after a hiatus of some time, but
it's good to have you
yeah,
back.
there's nothing quite like a boring economic policy announcement to drag me back on. So
yeah, exactly.
Pleased to be here.
Minor things like scandals, you know, machinations of leadership challenges, people crying and screaming on the media. Paul's asleep. He's deep asleep. One announcement.
That's just my weekly listen to you guys gossiping about
it. And then one announcement of an economic policy, wide awake. Can't keep him away with a stick. But also, welcome back. How did you think the announcement went, this Future Fund announcement, and what was your initial kind of reaction when you heard of it?
Yeah, it's interesting, eh? Like, I wasn't really paying too much attention to the media and politics, as I haven't been paying as much, to be honest, since the last election. And then, all of a sudden, this policy announcement comes out, and as you say, Labour have deliberately not been announcing policies for a little while, as often happens, between an election and for the next sort of year or so. But so they come out with this Future Fund policy announcement. What kind of struck me was that it was their first, I guess, major economic policy announcement for this coming election season, and seems like a bit of a kind of technical, wonky sort of announcement. I thought they would be coming out with, not necessarily capital gains tax, but a tax announcement of some kind, or perhaps some kind of infrastructure announcement, something along those lines. But anyway, they come out with this sovereign wealth fund. So the idea is that it's a kind of managed investment fund, similar to the superannuation fund, where it's a government investment fund, but it's kind of operated on a commercial basis at, as they say repeatedly, at arm's length from the government. So the ministers aren't making the investment decisions. They've just basically delegated the authority to, in this case, the guardians of the superannuation fund, to invest some money. And, and the particular purpose of this fund is to invest specifically in the New Zealand economy, New Zealand businesses. And they've said infrastructure, but that seems a little less certain to me. The kind of main push is to invest in like New Zealand startups, technology startups, and so on. And they've given some specific examples like Trade Me and Zero and Rocket Lab, because we need more military payloads and all this kind of stuff. But anyway, we can get into that. Yeah. And so some important details. So with the fund, they've said that they would put an initial capital injection of $200 million cash for the fund to invest in various things. And then also, crucially, they would transfer some of the ownership of some state assets into the fund. And so that would provide the fund with a significant balance sheet, which it could then borrow money against and invest some of that money. And also it would provide them with an income stream of the dividends from those state assets. So state-owned enterprises, think things like, the mixed ownership model, energy companies in New Zealand, but also, there's many other state-owned enterprises on the books, Transpower and other things that are tied to infrastructure and utilities and so on in the country. And yeah, so the super fund would then manage this asset pool with the intention of growing it over time and investing in the New Zealand economy. So yeah, that was kind of the announcement with the kind of purpose of enriching the capital pool, basically. So the argument goes, and they were claiming that there's lots of small companies that end up getting sold offshore or taking their business offshore or have foreign investment capital coming into these companies, which makes it more likely that they will end up getting sold or taking their business elsewhere. Even the super fund has most of its money invested offshore because those investments are obviously more profitable for them to maximize the return for that fund. But this particular fund would be for the purpose of keeping the growth of those investments in New Zealand and keeping the jobs and so on that come with that in New Zealand. So how effective that might be is another question, and there's, I think, a lot of problems with that kind of argument. But that's the stated purpose, at least.
Yeah, it's interesting. We're already kind of running into, I guess, a potential kind of conflict there, right? Is that if the purpose of this fund is a kind of risk averse, predictable spending kind of infrastructure pipeline, and I think it's worth mentioning that Infrastructure NZ immediately said, "This is a great idea," which I don't know how important you think that is. If I were Infrastructure New Zealand and someone said we're going to invest more in infrastructure, I'd probably say it was a good idea too, without needing to have a look at the fine print. If that was the plan, then you can do that, right? Government can spend more on infrastructure. Every national government spends all the money they can shake a stick at roads, for example, right? And we don't see any massive consternation about where that money's coming from. You can just borrow money. Like government bonds exist, you know?
Yeah, this is a really good point, and this is why the point about infrastructure, which was mentioned in the document, like the investments that the fund was going to invest in were New Zealand businesses and infrastructure projects.
Mm.
But there's been a few like comments in the media, which I think are quite on point around the infrastructure issue and touch on some things that you just mentioned. So Bernard Hickey was saying that it's actually much cheaper for the government to borrow money directly using its own balance sheet and invest that money directly in infrastructure projects, right? And so this fund would, because it's operating at arm's length from the government, it would kind of be looking at infrastructure projects in a different way, right? If
Mm.
infrastructure, typically longer term projects that deliver a smaller dividend over a longer period of time, right? They take a long time to develop, take a while to actually see the benefits of that. Lots of times, if you're talking about transport infrastructure and things like that, right? It would need to be like, if it's in the case of a road, it would need to be tolled or something. So there's like less ways to get immediate revenue
Mm.
from those projects. They have like indirect benefits to the economy. They allow us to get around to different places easier. They allow us to if it's power or internet infrastructure or something like that, they allow us to send information and communicate with each other and so on.
Because where's the money
Um,
coming from, right? You need to get a return. If we're talking commercial returns, suddenly the
exactly.
conversation isn't a political one, it's a commercial one. So where's the
Exactly
return
right.
on this new railroad that's going from, let's say, Auckland to Wellington? The question isn't, do the people demand it of the government? The question is a purely balance sheet one, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, well, I mean, Labour have said that this fund would be a bit different to that. It's not going to be entirely about commercial returns, but it's also going to be about what's in the public interest. But like you said earlier, there's just a little bit of a contradiction here because you've got a fund that is supposed to operate, with a kind of commercial eye and maximize. It's not going to not want to maximize its returns, right? Like these are fund managers. That's their job. That's what they do. They want the fund to grow. So it's going to be about maximizing returns, but it's also going to be about the public interest. But I just think that it would be much cleaner and easier. And it's a similar thing with the state-owned enterprises, and we can get into that. But it's like, if you're a government and you know that there's an infrastructure problem, you have experts to provide you advice on the specifics, of an infrastructure project or whatever, borrow the money, invest in it. It's going to be cheaper. It's going to be more direct. It's going to be more certain. And also, you're not going to have, like you say, the commercial pressures of like, well, is this worthwhile in a more immediate commercial sense? The government can kind of put their eye on it that says, actually, this is going to benefit the economy in many other ways. And from them, from a revenue perspective, so to speak, they're going to get tax revenues from the increased economic activity that surrounds an infrastructure project, right?
Mm.
The fund are not going to get that same tax revenue from increased spending in GST and
That's a really good
jobs
point.
and increased income tax and so on, right? And another thing about the Infrastructure New Zealand announcement, just while we're on this point, is that they did welcome the announcement by Labor, but they also kind of said that, oh, this would need to work in tandem with other sources of funding, right? Because it's not going to be enough on its own. And Bernard Hickey made this point, the government borrows lots of money for these large capital infrastructure projects, and the fund won't deliver that on its own. It's going to need to do things like have public-private partnerships. So these are other private enterprises, and consortiums that are going to invest in these projects. They're going to want a return even more than the fund is going to itself.
Yeah.
So there's that
Uh,
problem too.
A hell of a lot more. A hell of a lot more, right? Like,
Yeah,
not to sugarcoat it, it's a drop in the bucket compared to if you actually wanted to have a serious kind of infrastructure pipeline with some continuity, as both Labour and National have been kind of kayfabing that they do over the last few months. Yeah, I get it, right? Okay, let's dive into the detail. Can you shoot us through your kind of take on the announcement itself, how it looked over the actual document, what you thought of the presentation of it, all these sexy questions.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, before we dive into the detail of the document itself, I did think that, like, I watched the press conference, and obviously, like, lots of people have made, have had the reaction to the announcement that it was quite light on detail, right?
Mm.
There wasn't any numbers in the document, and it was just a little bit like vague around some of those questions that we've already talked about, right? And other things too. But one thing that kind of struck me about the announcement is that Barbara Edmonds, who normally is, quite sharp, was, yes, just seemed a little bit less prepared than what she normally is. And so that kind of gave me the impression that perhaps the policy announcement was put together in a bit of a rushed manner. Perhaps they intended to announce something else, that they hadn't quite agreed on or something like that. I have absolutely no idea. I'm just kind of hypothesizing as to why they weren't quite as sharp and the detail wasn't quite as fleshed out as what it normally is. But yeah, the document itself is I found it quite amusing, to be honest. So it's 12 pages long. The first two and the last two are pictures. So that leaves 8 pages.
So that's a third.
Um,
That's a third of the document is
the
beautiful
document was just
pictograms.
pictures. Yeah, exactly. And then there was only really one page which actually had some substantive detail about the fund itself, which talked about, the capital injection and the SOEs and its independence from government and what it was supposed to do and blah, blah, blah. And then a bunch of the other pages were basically like words that, you're very familiar with this being around politics so much, is that words that really don't say very much at all,
Mm.
stuff that everyone agrees with, like we want the economy to be stronger and blah, blah, blah. So, yeah, so it was quite thin on the ground, but there were a few important things to point out. So, with the SOEs in particular, and it would be good to dive into this a bit more, is Labour were very strong on the fact that they were going to protect the SOEs from being sold, right? That they weren't selling them to the fund, they weren't going to be privatized in the future, and they were going to be protected in legislation from being privatized. So that's a really important detail to discuss because there's a lot to unpack there, I think.
Yeah. So okay, let's talk state-owned enterprises then. I think that's probably the most important point to kind of start when we're going through the detail of the actual announcement is what does that mean? In like everyday New Zealand parlance, we think of state-owned enterprises probably as, I guess, the more recent neoliberal, if you want to use that word, reincarnation of public assets or public provisions of services. So on a non-accounting level, what does that mean? What does that change mean for New Zealanders?
Yeah. This is a really good point. And actually, I'm not sure if particularly younger New Zealanders probably won't be as familiar with this, right? So, like you say, the State-Owned Enterprises Act was in 1986, right? So, it's a piece of legislation that corporatized a lot of government agencies, previously government run and owned agencies. And so these state-owned enterprises are still government owned, but they're basically for-profit companies that need to operate under law as efficiently and in the same way as a private business would, right? So they have similar governance structures. They, have a similar need to deliver a dividend to their owner. It just so happens that their owner is the government, right? And so that was obviously a step along the road to privatization. And so not all, arms of the government were corporatized in the 80s and 90s, but lots of them were. So obviously we still have a public agency kind of health and education system, right, where they aren't supposed to deliver a profit. They are services that are provided at a cost to the taxpayer, and the New Zealand public enjoys the services for that cost, right? But these other things are like user pays and state enterprises return the dividend to the government. So the problem with transferring them, in my view, to this future fund is that the future fund will be less sympathetic towards a state-owned enterprise not doing so well, right? So let's say
financially,
that,
to be clear, right?
yeah, exactly.
In terms of outcomes, yeah, accounting outcomes.
Yeah, exactly right. So let's say you got Air New Zealand, right? And they are returning a dividend to the government, and then let's say a bunch of competition enters the market or whatever, and they start not doing so well, right? And actually, I mean, in New Zealand, we're bailed out by the government, some years ago now, under the Helen Clark government. But let's say a similar situation occurs, but in New Zealand are owned by the Future Fund instead of directly by the government, right? The Future Fund, like their purpose is to maximize their asset. They're going to have this poor performing asset that's going to be draining their asset pool, and they're going to want to do something about that, And so you've got the Labour government or the Labour Party have said that when they're in government, they will restrict this fund from being able to sell those assets, those seed assets. I mean, we don't know if Air New Zealand is going in there, right? But let's just say, as an example, one of those assets is performing poorly, then there's a bit of a conundrum. And I think that the government of the day, it could be a national government later down the track, right, will be provided some very strong arguments actually from the Future Fund that they should be allowed to sell this poor performing asset. It's for a commercial benefit and it's not benefiting the fund, and that's what the fund is there to do. So why can't they sell it? So I think this is a bit of a contradiction with the idea of the fund overall and setting it with the SOEs.
Yeah,
and it's a really tricky one.
And this is what Matthew Hooden said in his article, right? Is that it's possible that putting it in an arm's length, they keep repeating the phrase, it'll be at arm's length for government. Well, that isn't just a good thing, right? It might feel like a good thing to the left right now because the government happens to be a national government, but arm's length also means a decrease in political pressure on the outcomes of what those fund managers decide to do, right? So the justifications around whether it's selling assets or interests in whatever state-owned enterprises it might be will come purely out of economic performance, because as you say, if you're one of these guardians of the super fund, your job is to maximize revenue, right? Or maximize return on investment. And, if you were to put Air New Zealand in there, it turns out that maybe the number of people flying from Dunedin to Hamilton maybe isn't as many as you'd hope to maximize your investment. That puts a bit of pressure on there, right? It really doubles down on the kind of the commercialized imperative of those organizations, and that could flow up or down, right? That could flow down into the outcomes in those organizations, or it could flow up into the kind of macro political scene where political parties will start saying, well, this future fund, let's forecast 10 years from now it exists. It owns a bunch of state-owned enterprises, mixed ownership model, corporatized, bureaucratized kind of things that we would like to see run for the public good. But let's go to energy, right? Like the Jen Taylors have been making a hell of a lot in dividends, and it would be very inefficient for a future fund that was, funded by the dividends from these organizations to nationalize or allow regulation of these bodies, right, in a way that would actually be good for New Zealanders, but they don't have the same incentives as you or me or a government. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Totally, yeah. And I think a good example of that, actually, you brought up the energy companies, is that, and I think one of the other media commentators had a similar view on this, is like, if you, as the government, if you wanted to direct the energy companies as state-owned enterprises to, instead of paying you a dividend, you wanted them to reinvest that in new electricity generation. You had some political, directive that you wanted to provide those state-owned enterprises. Like, let's say it's for increased renewable generation or something like this, right? You have a particular political direction that you want to go in. You can use those state-owned enterprises to fulfill that political direction, right? But if you transfer, those to a fund, the fund doesn't have the power to make those decisions. It's a fund manager. It's supposed to grow the fund, and that's it. Or, and it might be provided a directive by the government to do that under certain constraints, like within New Zealand, for example. But it's not going to be provided with a directive to, make a decision about renewable energy generation or something like that. That's a decision that the government needs to make. So it's an important one. And I think, if we get back to the kind of more high level politics of it, this sort of came through in Labour's announcement as well, and some of the Q&A that happened afterwards, is that I saw this real reluctance to make political decisions. I also watched Barbara Evans' interview with Bernard Hickey, and towards the end of that, Bernard asked a question about, well, why doesn't the government just borrow this money and invest directly in infrastructure projects and what have you? And her answer was, well, ministers have been fiddling around with too much debt and this kind of thing, and if the dividends are coming back from the state-owned enterprises into the government coffers, then ministers can just go and splash this money around. She was literally using these terms. And I'm just thinking, this is the Labour Party, should be the left of centre party in this country. They should be more interventionist, right, in the economy than the centre right. And yet we've got the, potentially incoming Minister of Finance with these very skeptical ideas about, the ability of government ministers to set an economic direction. This is what we need. The market is not fulfilling our requirements in terms of energy and infrastructure. This is why they're proposing this fund, right? Because we have an infrastructure deficit. We have these economic problems in this country that, investment from capitalist firms and planning by capitalist markets is not fulfilling. And so we need a bit more economic direction and investment. And yeah, that's really what I think comes to the heart of the contradiction of this proposal,
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And you're right, just on a rhetorical level, that's National Party shit, right? This isn't what you should be expecting from the spokesperson of your Labour Party.
Yeah, and I mean this comes back to their tactics on tax and other economic areas as well. Labour have been very reluctant in the last 10 years plus to take criticism that will naturally come from the media of them being a bit more interventionist in the economy. They seem petrified of, being labeled as being, big spenders or being, bad at economic management or whatever. They're always trying to prove that they're better at national at managing the economy, and then they're never going to beat national at their own game. They have to do something different. And I just see it's just the same old in terms of their political positioning around maybe a slightly new idea for them,
Yeah, and in terms of I don't know, intervention, I suppose is a broad word, but industrial policy is back in vogue worldwide, right? In Anglophone countries especially, it seems like it's not illegal anymore to talk about picking winners, essentially, right? Which in the 90s was just anathema, and the 2000s even was even the Labour Party would have these kind of neoliberal blinkers on and say, oh, the government shouldn't pick winners. Right, remember that kind of magic phrase from when we were younger. But for some reason now, picking winners is fine. Whether it's who knows whatever they're going to invest in, right? They won't tell us. But it's New Zealand has a bit of a history with funds like this, right? So I thought it would just be worth mentioning the NZ Super Fund, what used to get kind of more colloquially referred to as the Cullen Fund, which most kind of people have a more, let's say, sympathetic reaction to in its kind of purpose and structure. And historically, Michael Cullen, I think in general, has a pretty good kind of reputation these days in terms of kind of seeing which way the wind was blowing. So can you make a comparison with that? I mean, how are we to distinguish these things in how we think about funds in New Zealand?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the superannuation fund, I think, is a bit more clear as you allude to in its purpose, right? When it was set up, there was a concern that we've got a universal superannuation system in New Zealand. We have an aging population, so the demands on that money from the government were going to become more significant over time. And so Michael Cullen and under the Helen Clark government set up that fund to basically ensure that over time, over some decades, this fund would grow, and then it would be able to help provide the government with some additional funding to maintain a universal superannuation system, right? And alongside that, obviously, we have KiwiSaver too, which was set up at a similar time and is, not a replacement for New Zealand superannuation, but in a similar way, it's supposed to supplement superannuation. And I mean, maybe I'm a cynic about all this kind of stuff, but I also think that having the presence of the super fund and also KiwiSaver do provide an avenue to superannuation being privatized, basically, or it becoming less universal, right? We don't need as much superannuation anymore, universal superannuation, because we have KiwiSaver, we have the super fund to supplement these things. So yeah, so that has also got me a little bit worried about this future fund as well, is that it might be well intentioned around the assets that are originally put into it, the seed assets, but down the track there could be some other consequences of the presence of the fund. Yeah, and in terms of I guess comparisons with overseas, so with the super fund over here, it has quite a different purpose. And another thing that we should mention is that the super fund invests makes lots of its investments, overseas for maximizing its return, and because it has that sole purpose of like investing to maximize its return, with the purpose of generating as much money as possible for the funding of superannuation in the future. Okay, so that's quite a tight purpose. And so when we compare the future fund idea with sovereign wealth funds overseas, which is another comparison that we can make, I think it's important to look at how the overseas sovereign wealth funds have been established. And most of the large successful ones, so lots of the examples that regularly come up as the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund, Temasek, which is one of the Singaporean sovereign wealth funds, which is mentioned in the Labour document. And, there's a bunch of others. The Chinese have a couple of large sovereign wealth funds. The Gulf states also have many. These large successful ones, often there's a large correlation with these countries' current account balances. Okay, so we're talking about trade surpluses and deficits and current account surpluses and deficits. It's when large exporting countries, they're exporting most of these countries oil, right? In terms of Norway, the Gulf states, Australia as well, natural resources, large export base. Okay, so they're getting in a lot more money than what they're sending out overseas, right? It contributes to a large current account surplus. That often is the source of a lot of the seed funding for these sovereign wealth funds when they're established. And it kind of maintains them and it maintains their success, right? Because these large exporting companies continue to export their commodities, that grows the fund, and so on and so on. And it keeps growing and enables the fund to be successful. In New Zealand, we don't have that. We have a large current account deficit. Sometimes we have a small trade surplus. Sometimes it's a trade deficit. Obviously, our main exports are agriculture and horticulture, but our large current account deficit is due to a large amount of our profits from large finance companies here and banks being owned offshore, mainly in Australia, right? So a lot of our New Zealand banks send their profits to Australia. And so we have a kind of drain of money in New Zealand. We don't have the same pool of funds to go into a sovereign wealth fund like these other successful nations do. So I think that's an important comparison that we should make as well. And yeah, it gives me less optimism that a fund like this would be successful. And then even then, we're only talking about success in terms of a commercial mindset, right? It's going to be commercially successful. That's going to then invest money into what? New Zealand startup businesses. Okay, so we're just talking about more investment in private businesses. So yeah, it's not really it's not the model I would pick. Let's put it that way.
and it rules out those externalities that we mentioned earlier on, right? Because if your definition of success as a fund manager is profit loss, then of course you're not looking at social benefits, or has this infrastructure investment enabled, let's say, more disabled people to travel from home to the park than otherwise would have, right? That's not on the balance sheet. People on benefits enabled to live a better life than they would have otherwise by the kind of social wraparound support of those networks. That, none of that's on these balance sheets, right? But also, just more narrowly, it's interesting you bring up the kind of funneling money to private ownership model, because I saw New Zealand already has government investment in these kind of startup companies,
like the venture funds and things like that. Yeah,
New Zealand Growth Capital Partners. We have Elevated NZ and Aspire that this national government had put another $100 million in this year. If really what you wanted to do was jazz that up, then why not put $200 million more if to give to whichever, private business has come up with the
Mm.
latest, I don't know, Uber for OnlyFans or whatever the latest like cool blockchain based lie is from some Zoomer. If that's the dream, that seems on the very opposite end of the spectrum from the predictable infrastructure pipeline discussion, right?
Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah, so I think that would be a much more deliberate way of doing it if you're going to fund startups. And also, I think there's a question of like, do these startups really struggle to get investment, right? Like if, we have such an open global economy these days, right? Like lots of technology startups will be going to Silicon Valley, will be talking to investors, not only in New Zealand, overseas, and lots of their investment will be a combination of investors from New Zealand, from overseas, or whatever, to insert some capital into their business to grow. And then I think there's a really important question of like, okay, if you've got this fund that's going to invest in these startups, the stated aims in the Labour Party document is that this is going to help retain jobs and money and opportunities here in New Zealand, right? I don't know if that really follows because, like, let's say you've got a small technology startup, right? Maybe a software company. I used to work for a software company that was a startup, very successful one in New Zealand that ended up being acquired overseas, right? This is a very similar type pattern that happens with these technology companies, right? They'll get seed funding, they'll run at a loss for many years while they grow their customer base, and grow their business and mature their product. And then the shareholders, the investors, right? They're looking to realize their investment. Okay, they're not going to want to stick around forever in a loss-making company and risk that company getting out competitive the market or whatever. They want to quote unquote exit from the investment, right? And make a capital gain on their initial investment. And so how do they do that? One of two ways. They either list on the stock market, right, and make investing in the company open to everyone, or they get acquired. And that's often what happens is that if you have a company, a small company in New Zealand or another small country or whatever, it'll often get acquired by a larger company that's doing a similar, type work, a competitor basically overseas, in order to, add to their customer base, right? They're going to acquire all of those customers. And often what happens is they end up rolling that company into their own company branding and everything. And then there's economies of scale. So they'll, make people redundant and so on and so forth. These are the problems that Labour are saying that this future fund is going to solve, right? It's going to keep jobs in New Zealand. It's going to keep investment in New Zealand. But just by investing the money, part of the money that is going to go to these companies from the future fund, I don't see how you can then stop, those other investors or even the future fund wanting to realize the gain on their investment. And how are you going to actually regulate those companies to keep the jobs in New Zealand, or to keep the company from selling later on? Like you can't do that. And so like these, the fund is not going to be able to put those types of conditions on its investment. So yeah, I think there's a bunch of problems with that. So
And
I
if
can't even remember what your original question
No,
was, but
yeah, that's I
hopefully
think
that makes sense.
that's a really fundamental issue because either your fund managers and the purpose of this fund either is to maximize its own profits or it's not, right? And if your plan in investing in New Zealand businesses, zero to trade me to whatever it might be, is to make a return for the government, which seems to be what Labour's suggesting with all its talk about an alternative to tax. If the plan is revenue return, then it needs to maximize its investment, right? So then, in which case, why, as an aspiring business owner, is it going to be easier to get seed funding from the government than it is from banks or investors or capital, venture capital, who are already looking for maximum return, right? Like, what's the difference? What's the qualitative difference in the type of investment they're
Mm.
going to make? And if the government is implicitly planning to just flood the venture capital market with their own money, then what's that going to do to the venture capital market? There's a whole bunch of perverse incentives there that I think just opens like a can of worms that isn't really being discussed yet.
Yeah, and then you also give away your ability as a government, like
Hmm.
to have a political direction for that investment, right?
Hmm.
So you're not going to, yeah, you're not going to be able to tell the future fund, and actually that's the specific thing that Labour have said is that they want it to be arm's length. The government aren't, quote unquote, they're not like best placed to make the specific investment decisions. They want the fund managers to do that, and so yeah, you've got this kind of disconnect between those two things. You're saying that you're doing it for the good of the economy and the public interest, but that doesn't really fit with the model,
And if you just wanted to get maximum growth, I mean, NZ super funds doing that, right? And 90% of their investments are overseas. Take that money and return it to the New Zealand economy as opposed to, I don't know. I think there are a whole bunch of kind of internal contradictions there.
Yeah. It just seems like a bit of outsourcing of economic management, right? Like
Mm.
you're saying, okay, we're not going to make the infrastructure investments or the investments in technology companies ourselves, but this fund manager can, and then we're going to delegate all control to them, and then their fund's going to grow, and then they're going to continue that model. And then at the same time, the government's not going to have the dividends from the state-owned enterprises anymore, which it can then, those were going into the kind of central government coffers, right? So they could then spend that money on whatever, health investment, education investment. That's not going to exist anymore. It's going to be under the funds management. So you're giving that away too.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many questions, right? But I guess on a broader kind of level, how fair is it, do you think, to criticize parties in opposition in New Zealand for a lack of detail? Like, I totally agree that this was a brochure. Like, it didn't have any of the detail you'd want from an economic policy. It didn't even say $200 million in the document, which is insane to me because it's the only number they had when asked about it at the stand up. But what opposition parties in New Zealand tend to return to is that they don't have treasury, right? They don't have the machine of state behind them to create all the details to these policies. So it does tend to be more of a direction of travel that you indicate when you're in opposition, and then you get into power and you go, oh, actually, we're going to fiddle with some of these numbers. Like the National Party had very, very little before they were voted in this time, and a bunch of the details in their policies ended up pretty different. So you could say, kind of devil's advocate, like all we're going to get at best, even if they do give us specifics, that's honest, is a direction of travel, right? So if that's the direction of travel you want, then you support that party to do X, create a policy for the purpose of doing this. And you have to sort of trust them with the details.
Yeah, I mean it's a fair point, I guess, but I think that it's kind of a weak argument because it's basically saying that, well, national just as bad, at providing a lack of policy detail. And I just think that like the left on economic policy in particular, and not just in New Zealand, like and across the Anglophone world and so on, has been pretty absent with a response like post-global financial crisis. How are we going to change the economy and get out of this kind of neoliberal trap that we've been in for like 40 plus years, So there's that like really broad kind of expectation, I think, that I just expect a little bit more personally. And like when it comes to Labour in New Zealand, like, look, I'm not asking for socialism now. Like, I'm just saying that can we please have a little bit more coherence to our economic policy? I mean, even some just slightly more interventionist, like social democratic policy around, intervening in the energy markets or something like that, like that's far from, nationalization, right? But it's something that is a lot more coherent. And you can put like, there's so many, think tanks and like white papers about these types of things that the Labour Party can lean on, and I just don't think it's not an excuse that they're not in government and they don't have those resources or whatever. You've got a caucus of how many MPs, 40 MPs, 30 MPs, whatever. You've got all the funding and stuff that goes with that. Like it's your job to put policies in front of the public and to argue for them and to a year out, less than a year out from an election, your first economic policy announcement, and to come out with something that like just doesn't even feel that well thought through is quite poor in my view. So there's that whole rant. But the other point that I want to make is that if this is the direction of travel, like you say, then I don't think it's a good direction of travel, right? It's not even in the direction that I would choose. I think it's kind of more in a right-wing direction than a left-wing direction. And people might just, people on the left might disagree with that. And I know that there's a lot of support for sovereign wealth funds out there on the left. And, in particular for things like dividend paying sovereign wealth funds that, in my view, are a little bit more just like redistributionist, right? Like they're trying to just it's sort of like it's sort of like a redistributionist tax policy or something like that. That you're trying to reduce inequality in the economy through paying dividends from a sovereign wealth fund. Anyway, that's another example. The direction of travel, I think, of doing something like this is like what we were talking about before. It's outsourcing your economic planning, right? As a government, you're putting state-owned enterprises in a position where they're more likely, in my view, be vulnerable to privatization or at least like pressure from the fund manager and from the business community to privatize them, right? Because perhaps they're not performing commercially very well. And you're reducing the direct dividends that the government would get from their assets in order to invest in other areas of the economy. So I just think that the direction is not very good. And even if it was, the execution is not very good either. So, yeah.
2 for 2. Yeah, nice. That's a good rejoinder to that. But I think it's worth, as we kind of, let's call it maybe 10 minutes wrap up. Isn't it a left wing goal? The devil continues to say, is it a left wing goal to take over more of the economy, to increase the state's kind of ownership over enterprise or delivery of goods and services? So this is the conversation that people used to have about, I mean, still do, but you felt like a more active kind of conversation maybe 10 years ago when everyone wanted to be Scandinavia. That isn't this the goal, right? Isn't this what you people want, is state ownership and control over the means of production? And one way to do that is to invest the dividends on the currently existing capitalist system to take over that system for the purposes of government ownership and direction. So I guess what I'm saying in quite an oblique kind of way is, what would a left-wing version of this look like, right? Like, you can see on a kind of ideological level that you could understand those terms in a way that would make this look quite left-wing, which is evidenced by the fact that Labour keeps saying it's New Zealand ownership for New Zealand people, for New Zealand future, for New Zealand funds, and that seems like the amount of kind of thought that they've put into it. But you can see there's kind of like an intuitive kind of left-wingedness to it, right? Under the mask. Well, that is the mask, I suppose. Sorry. But you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
of states' allocation of resources, which I agree is redistributive, but isn't that sort of the point?
Well, yeah, so there's a couple of things there. It depends, I think, on what the direction you're coming from, right? And moving to. So with this particular proposal, in my view, it's shifting further away from government control over a part of the economy, right? Which is, the state-owned enterprises directly owned by the government, paying a dividend to the government, which then the government has flexibility to invest, right? You're going from that situation to a situation where you have commercially minded fund managers who are managing the fund for commercial returns and, for investment in mostly, probably entirely or mostly private companies in New Zealand. Okay, so that to me is a less kind of left wing or like socialist kind of economy than what it was before, if it was even that before, And then the other thing is, well, can there be like a situation where sovereign wealth funds are, collective ownership in the way that we would like them to be as lefties? And I think that there can be. Like, I'm not completely like opposed to these wealth funds, but I do think that the current trend, right, is for them to be commercially minded. They're for growth of commodities, for commodity production, for wealth under the current capitalist structure, right, where we have economies that largely grow in the interests of the already wealthy. The benefits of that growth are often not seen by the large majority of the population. And sovereign wealth funds are operating essentially as a state capitalist vehicle, right? So they might be owned by the state, but they're operating in a capitalist economy, and they're not really addressing, in my view, the crux of this is getting a bit Marxist perhaps, but the crux of what we're trying to tackle as lefties, which is the social relations, right, between workers and capitalists. It's very Marxist, but a sovereign wealth fund does not address that issue at all. And a lot of the struggles, we've had 100,000 people right out on the streets protesting the government about their working conditions and their living conditions, right? Is the sovereign wealth fund is not going to address that. It's not going to really. I mean, Labour have said that it's going to somehow make the cost of living better. I don't see how investing in zero, you know, brings down the cost of living for everyday New Zealanders. So yeah, our sovereign wealth funds are left-wing nirvana. I mean, the other thing which we did touch on a little bit is dividend-paying sovereign wealth funds. Okay, so there is an Alaskan fund which, instead of reinvesting the profits into, I mean, it would partially reinvest the profits to further grow the fund, but in addition to that, it pays a dividend to equally to every citizen, right? So it's sort of like a universal dividend. And I mean, we have some structures that are similar in New Zealand. So for those that live in parts of Auckland, there's this thing called Entrust, where there's a trust that owns part of Vector, which is the Lions company in Auckland, and every year you get a $365 check or whatever it is in your mail. This is a nice thing to have, and it's a form of social ownership, right? With a dividend paying equal to every member of that community. So some of these things are actually like quite popular, across the political spectrum as well. And so that's a large argument for a dividend paying sovereign wealth fund. But again, I think that it comes back to that issue of the social relations that we have in the economy, which is a source of so many issues, so many social ills. A sovereign wealth fund, whether it pays a dividend or not, doesn't actually address those things. So that's what I would say in response to that question, I guess.
Yeah, and I mean, just talking about capacity, right? Like if there's an intention to actually change the not just the direction of travel, but the qualitative, like what's the state there to do? If that is implicit in this, then it sure as hell isn't explicit. Like as you say, there are all these kind of grandiose sounding claims around how this could make the country better, not just this, but sovereign wealth funds in general, you could say, that they kind of alleviate pressure on the state having to do certain things, but that's not really spelled out, right? Anything beyond as you've said, kind of the correlation between countries with trade account surpluses and successful sovereign wealth funds, anything beyond that is kind of I don't think it's obvious that it actually does kind of reconfigure the state's capacity to do shit. If Labour actually wanted to build, let's say, high-speed rail across the length of the country, this doesn't seem to get further or closer towards that goal. It's sort of tangential to that, isn't it?
Yeah, I agree. I don't think it will really, be able to scratch the surface of those types of big investments that we need into the economy. Like I think only really the government can do that more directly, and that's what I would want to see. I mean, both Edmonds and Hipkins have said that there's going to be more detail to come about this, and I think that there will now after the response to the proposal has been, similar to this in lots of ways, but critical of the level of detail and some of the coherence of the idea. So I wouldn't be surprised to see a bit more detail on it, and I hold out hope that that's going to yeah, give us some answers to some of these questions, right? But we can only wait and see. I'm not filled with confidence, but I'll hold out some hope.
It may get less bad on that stirring note. We can wrap up. Is there anything you think, if people are sort of curious about this, that people should go and look up or read up on? Are there any comparisons you think are illuminating?
Yeah, there's some good. I mean, firstly, I would say read a bunch of the articles by some of the authors that we've talked about. There's some good pieces out there of commentary. There's some not so good, but there's lots of good stuff out there. I mean, I really like, to be honest, when things like this get announced. I like going back and just reading up a little bit on the history about it. So, like, we've talked a lot about state-owned enterprises. So, how did they come about? What's the history there? Obviously, privatization is an important issue to me, and I think that it needs more challenging from the left as well, in New Zealand and elsewhere. So, there's lots of good writing on that kind of thing. Yeah, but and there's also lots of good papers and resources out there on social wealth funds, and you know their benefits and pitfalls. So yeah, get out there, do some research, and keep an open mind.
Wow, wholesome. What an unusually wholesome and positive ending for a 10200 episode. I'm sorry, listeners. I know you come here for the most embarrassingly black-pilled and pessimistic takes about New Zealand politics. So to leave you on an upbeat note like that at the end we'll probably lose half our listenership. I can only apologize. Thank you, everybody. That's been another episode of 1 of 200. That's goodbye from me and goodbye from Paul. Any plans this week?
Any plans? Well, I'm currently in Los Angeles, so I'll be around here for a
Nice.
But
if you see Paul on the
but
street in Los Angeles, share your
come
latest
say hi.
New Zealand politics nerdery with him. All right.
But no, thanks everyone for your time.
Cheers. And that's been 1 of 200 for another week. We will catch you next time.
If artificers are, then I'm living a pointless life, but learning all your lessons. Fucking politics, there's no distinction. The roads apart now. It's paid with good intentions, and I'll admit that I'm at a loss for what to say when they criticism cost me ought to stay. 'Cause I live amongst the people every day. This vindictive, forgetful fucking rain. It feels like we're